All right, welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going deep on a book that might just make you question, really everything you thought you knew about the government. We're diving into Albert J. Nock's Our Enemy, the State, and it's a book that's just as relevant today as it was back in 1935 when it was written.
What I think is really cool about Nock is that he doesn't just like critique policies or anything. He goes after like the whole idea of the state.
Hmm.
And to really get what he's saying, we need to understand this key difference he makes.
Okay, yeah, so break it down for me. What is the difference between what we normally call government and what Nock calls the state?
Okay, well, think about government as like a tool, like just like a hammer.
Okay.
You can use it to build a house. You can use it to break things. It really just depends on who's holding it and what they want to do with it.
Okay, I'm with you. So how does the state fit in with this?
The state, in Nock's view, is kind of like someone using that hammer to break into your house, steal your stuff, and then try to tell you it was for your own good. It's really about like one group of people using force and disguising it as authority to exploit another group for their benefit.
Okay, well, that's a pretty bleak picture. So if government is this tool, what makes the state so inherently exploitative?
Well, he argues that the very origin of the state is rooted in conquest and economic exploitation. Just look back through history, the Roman Empire expanding through military conquest, the feudal system in Europe with the lords taking all the wealth from the serfs. It's all about one group dominating another to get more money.
Okay, so are you saying that the state is just an inevitable consequence of human nature? Are we all just doomed to be taken advantage of by the powerful?
Not necessarily. Nock points out that there are places where the state didn't even really emerge. Like, he uses the example of Native American hunting tribes. You know, they lived in a way that made it pretty impractical to exploit them. You can't really enslave a nomadic hunter.
Right.
And there's no real point in conquering their territory if your whole way of life depends on just moving around.
So for those societies, the hammer of government wasn't really needed for exploitation because their way of life didn't even allow for that power dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. And this brings us to a really important question. What about the American state?
Right.
We love to think of ourselves as this beacon of, freedom, individual rights, all that. How does that line up with what Nock is saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm here to find out.
Right.
So how did the American state develop? And did it avoid this pattern of exploitation that Nock's talking about?
Well, you might be surprised to hear that Nock sees the American state as a merchant state right from the very beginning. He argues that even back in the colonies, the seeds of exploitation were already being planted.
Okay, now I'm a little skeptical. We all learned about these, brave colonists fighting for freedom and liberty and all that. How does Nock turn that on its head?
Well, he digs deep into early colonial history and focuses on examples like the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He says that despite all the talk about religious freedom, it was really just a small group of wealthy individuals using the system to line their own pockets.
So he's saying that the colonists who, came here to escape oppression, they ended up creating a system that was just as oppressive, just in a different way.
That's the heart of his argument, yeah. He points to things like the land ownership system. It created a very clear division between those who owned property and those who didn't. And that really set the stage for this exploitative economic system.
Okay. So what about all those big ideals we associate with the founding of America? The natural rights, the popular sovereignty, all that. Was that all just for show?
Well, that's a question Nock really grapples with. He recognizes how powerful those ideas were in dismantling the feudal system. But he says they never really got put into practice fully. Even the founding fathers, while they talked about these great ideals, ultimately designed a system that put property rights above everything else.
So they used these huge ideas to get rid of one power structure, but they ended up making a new one that was just as self-serving, just with different words.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, Nock says that because the American state copied the British system, it also adopted these specific mechanisms that allowed this exploitation to just keep going.
Okay, so now you've got me hooked. Let's get into those mechanisms. What are we talking about here? How did they help the people in power stay in control?
Well, you've got the representative system, for example. On the surface, it seems like, the foundation of democracy. You vote for people to speak for you.
Right, that's the idea anyway.
But Nock says this actually puts a lot of distance between people and the decisions that affect their lives. Instead of everyone participating directly, you have a small group making the choices for everybody. And they're often more influenced by lobbyists and special interest groups than by the needs of the people they're supposed to be representing.
So instead of a real democracy, you end up with this system that can be easily manipulated and corrupted.
Yeah, exactly. And he adds to that, the fixed term of office. This might seem like a good thing to prevent tyranny, but Nock suggests that it actually makes the state less responsive to what people want.
Right.
If the leaders know they have a set time and power, they're more likely to just focus on their own goals and political games instead of, taking care of the immediate needs of their constituents.
That's interesting. It's like they're just on autopilot for a certain time period, regardless of what's really going on.
Right. And then you have judicial review, which gives the courts power to interpret laws and even overturn the will of the people, even if it was expressed through their elected representatives. While this can be used to protect individual rights, Nock argues it can also be used to give the state more power and limit true popular sovereignty.
So each of these mechanisms, although they might seem reasonable at first, can actually be used to go against the very principles of democratic governance that they're supposed to be upholding. It's almost like a trick, using the promise of democracy to hide the reality of state control.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this leads us to the question of, well, how did this all actually work out? Did the American state really become this tool for economic exploitation that Nock talks about?
That's the big question. Lay it on me. What examples does he give?
He points to a history of the state interfering in the free market in ways that benefit certain groups and hurt others. Take tariffs, for example. By putting taxes on imported goods, the state can make the price of domestic products go up artificially. This protects some industries, but it hurts consumers who have to pay more.
So the state is picking winners and losers in the market, instead of just letting competition and consumer choice decide.
Exactly. And then there are subsidies. The state uses taxpayer money to support certain industries, often the ones with powerful lobbyists, even if those industries aren't actually very efficient or competitive.
Sounds like a recipe for cronyism and corruption.
Nock also talks about land grants, where the state gives huge pieces of land to private individuals or corporations, often for very cheap. This not only puts a ton of wealth in the hands of a few, but it also takes land away from people who might have used it to make a living.
It's like the classic story of the rich getting richer with help from the state.
And this takes us to another point, the cycle of intervention. Nock says that when the state interferes in one area, it often causes unintended consequences that force it to intervene even more, creating the spiral of expanding state power.
Like a snowball, one intervention leads to another, and pretty soon, the state is involved in every part of our lives.
That's it. He gives the example of agricultural subsidies. They were supposed to help farmers, but they ended up creating a system where farmers were dependent on the subsidies. And it also messed up the market, and now it needs constant adjustments and interventions just to keep going.
A classic example of good intentions backfiring, leading to a mess of bureaucracy and unintended consequences.
And it's not just economics, it's every part of society. Nock argues that the state depends on public ignorance and apathy. The less we understand about what it really is, the more we rely on it. And the easier it is for the state to just increase its power without anyone noticing.
Okay, that's kind of scary. So just by going along with things, accepting the state as some kind of force for good, are we actually making ourselves weaker?
That's a big part of Nock's argument. He points to things like how people accept unemployment as just a natural thing. We've been told it's just part of the economy. We don't see it as a possible result of state policies that are creating scarcity and making us dependent on the system.
So we're basically being tricked into complacency, accepting problems that were created by the state as if they were just facts of life.
Exactly. And the more we expect the state to fix our problems, the more power we give to it. And then we become less able to solve problems on our own. It's a cycle of dependence that weakens individuals and communities.
It's like we're trading freedom and independence for a fake sense of security, becoming more and more reliant on the very thing that Nock says is causing many of our problems. But he doesn't just leave us with this grim outlook, right? What does he think we can do about it?
He talks about resisting, starting with education. He says it's really important to understand what the state really is, to see through the propaganda and recognize how much it wants to just grow its own power.
So knowledge is power, right? The more we understand how it all works, the harder it is to manipulate us.
That's right. But understanding is just the start. He also says we need to take back our social power. We need to be more self-reliant, help each other out willingly, and find solutions outside of the state's control.
So it's about building something different, creating new ways of doing things that give power back to individuals and communities so they can take care of themselves.
That's a big part of it. Nock thinks that a strong society is one that's decentralized, with strong local communities, independent businesses, and people working together voluntarily. This kind of society can push back against the growing power of the state.
This is where it starts to sound really radical. It's like he's saying we need to step outside the system, find our own solutions, and take back control from the very thing that says it's working for us. But is that even possible today? I mean, the state seems so huge, so powerful, so involved in everything.
You're not wrong. And this is where Nock's work gets really interesting. He wrote this way back in 1935. But what he said about the future of America is kind of spooky how relevant it is today.
Okay, now you've got me really curious. What kind of future did he see?
He predicted more and more collectivism, the government getting bigger and bigger, and finally the whole social structure falling apart because the state just got too powerful.
Wow, that's intense. How much of that are we seeing happen today? Are we going down that same road?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? We are definitely seeing some of the things he talked about happening, but it's up to each of us to look at what's going on and decide how much Nock's analysis applies to what we're experiencing.
It's a challenge to take this historical perspective, this critique of the state, and figure out how it applies to our world today. But it's also pretty empowering.
Absolutely. Nock's work isn't about giving up, it's about waking up. It's about shaking us out of our complacency and encouraging us to become more aware, more critical, and more active in shaping the world we want to live in.
So how do we take all this and apply it to our lives? What's the one question that we should all be asking ourselves?
That's the big question Nock asks, and it's one that we all have to think about. There aren't any easy answers, but his work suggests that maybe the way forward is to reclaim our individual sovereignty, our responsibility for ourselves and our communities.
So it's not about just waiting for the state to fix things for us. It's about taking control of our lives and finding solutions outside the system.
Exactly. Nock's vision is one of, radical self-reliance, a society where people and communities can meet their own needs by working together and helping each other out, instead of relying on the state's power to force things.
It's a powerful vision, but it makes me wonder, how do we even start to shift towards that kind of society? The state seems so deeply rooted in every part of our lives.
Yeah, no doubt it's a huge task. But Nock believed that change starts with what each individual does, with each of us making choices to step outside the system wherever we can, build different structures, and support those who are working to make a fairer world.
It's almost like we have to become pioneers, in a way, forging new paths and creating new models for how we want to live and relate to each other.
That's a great way to put it. It takes a lot of courage, a willingness to question the way things are and try new ways of being.
So if our listeners are ready to take on that challenge, where do they even begin?
Well, I'd say the first step is education. Nock himself was a big believer in self-education. He thought people should take charge of their own learning, find information from lots of different sources, and learn how to think critically to separate truth from propaganda.
So it's about becoming informed citizens, not just passively accepting whatever information the state or the media throws at us.
Exactly. And it's not just about having knowledge, it's about using that knowledge to do something. Nock believed that individuals could make a difference, even with small acts of resistance. It could be as simple as choosing to support local businesses instead of big corporations, or opting out of state-run programs whenever you can.
It's about the everyday choices we make that all together shape the world we live in.
Right. And don't forget the power of community. Nock thought strong local communities were crucial for pushing back against the state's attempts to centralize power. Get involved in your community, connect with your neighbors, support local initiatives, and build relationships based on trust and helping each other out.
It's about rediscovering those traditional ways of being social that have been weakened by the state getting involved in everything.
Exactly. And lastly, don't lose hope. Nock's work might sound pessimistic sometimes, but it's really a call to action, a reminder that we can create our own future even when things seem impossible.
It's a powerful message to end on. So everyone listening, if you want to explore these ideas more deeply, I highly recommend getting a copy of Our Enemy, the State, and reading it for yourself.
It's a thought-provoking book, but it'll definitely make you rethink everything you thought you knew about power and the potential for individuals and communities to be free.
This has been an amazing deep dive, and as always, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, questioning what you think you know, and creating your own path towards a more just and fair world. Until next time, keep diving deep.